this computer. Very good. Yeah, so do stop me if you have any questions. And it has turned into a bit of a mini lecture, but certainly at the end we'll have a good half hour for a good meaty discussion. So I hope that will be good. I said the theme was on emotional attunement. Having created the session, I've realized that it's largely about the background of emotional attunement. And the 4 key sections are attachment, emotional communication and attunement, emotional components and interpretation, the interpersonal nature of emotion, and emotional regulation in childhood and adulthood. Okay, so we've got 4 sections. Please do interrupt if need be. Okay, so the first thing to sort of remind you of is something we've talked about before, that humans are born to be relational creatures. We've got a very long human infancy. We're born before our brains are fully developed, and therefore we are wholly reliant on bigger or adult caregivers for our survival. So it's really hardwired into us to be emotionally reliant. And just to kind of convince you of this, they did this horrible study in 1958 with these poor macaque baby monkeys, where they raised them in isolation, and then they put in the cages, they put in this wire mummy that delivered milk, and they put in a wire mummy covered in soft fabric but no milk. And the monkeys ignored the milk and clung to the soft fabric. In other words, you know, it's absolutely built in to kind of have that attachment relationship with a caregiver. In case you're wondering, yes, that is a small child in the background. My flatmate has her niece over at the moment. Okay, so one of the big names that you might have heard in attachment is Bowlby. So this is like the 1960s, late 1960s. At that point in time, nobody really thought much about how, you know, kids relate to caregivers. They, for example, advised parents to let the child cry it out because they need to learn to be independent. And they also had this whole thing earlier in the century where they thought that the more you touched kids, the more likely you were to give them diseases. So they were encouraging parents, you know, hands-off approach. So when Bowlby came in and said, no, children need these close bonded relationships, this was groundbreaking. And the theory that you've probably heard is attachment theory, saying that we are highly influenced in adulthood by the experiences we have with our caregivers in childhood. But I do want to put the disclaimer in that these can be modified by new experiences of relating. So if you're hearing anything today that sounds as though it's all over because when you were 1.5 years old, you didn't get quite the perfect experience, then please remember it's modifiable over the lifespan. And it's wonderful to know this stuff, to understand ourselves better, to how we relate to other people, perhaps our own parenting or teaching styles, and also so that we can work to you know, do that development that most of us need still in adulthood, because no childhood is, you know, perfect. So good to know. Okay, so Bowlby talked about he says that we have internalized working models. It's like an internalized belief system, and that belief system is around 3 things. The first is yourself. You have beliefs about yourself. How capable am I at getting my needs met? I'll say that again. How capable am I at getting my needs met? Do I believe I can get my needs met? And another part about yourself is how worthy am I of getting my needs met? How worthy? And you know, we hear a lot about that now in adulthood and the literature in mental health, working with people to develop their sense of competence, agency, and also their sense of worthiness. Second thing is other people. So how much can I rely on significant others to comfort and care for me? Can I rely on people? Can I trust people? Do I truly believe that people will care for me, that they will comfort me? And then the third component is the relationship between these two things. How well can relationships between yourself and others weather the challenges, like survive the difficulties that we all face? And how can we sustain effective communication? Okay, so like I said, Bowlby called these internal working models. They're basically, these three things are templates for how we go into relationships with other people across the lifespan based on these beliefs. Okay, if you want to interrupt with any questions, you're very welcome to. Okay, so you may have heard that from this research, they came up with 4 attachment types. So someone called Mary Ainsworth in the 60s was also looking at this field, and she created a test called the strange situation test that she conducted with 9 to 18-month-old babies. And basically, baby's in the room with mom's playing happily with the baby, then a stranger enters the room, mum interacts with baby and stranger, then mum leaves the room, and the stranger's left in the room with the baby, and then finally mum returns to the room. That's the situation. And yes, it is mothers. It was the 1960s, and this was still a big focus on, like, you know, mother as the primary caregiver. So from this, they discovered that children reacted in 4 distinct ways. The first is called secure, and that's type B. And basically, these kids were distressed when mum left, and when she returned, they looked for her comfort and they accepted her comfort. Okay, so there's a sense of emotional connection between these babies and their caregivers. Now, the other 3 categories are described as insecure. First is type A, and those are avoidant babies, avoidant people, avoidant attachment style. So those kids, when mum left the room, they weren't distressed. And when she returned, they avoided interacting with her. The third type, also insecure, was described as ambivalent type C. So these babies, when mum returned, they looked for contact and then rejected her, like backwards, forwards, ambivalent. And then the fourth type is disorganized. And this is when the behavior is really contradictory, kind of unpredictable. So the kids would be approaching, but really apprehensive about it. Okay, so we've got 4 attachment types. And again, I really would say, hear these things lightly. These are theories. They came about in the 60s. They have been very powerful, very important, very useful, but they are not the be-all and end-all in explaining human relationships, emotions, everything. They're just useful ways of thinking about it. And personally, I can see myself in most of these categories. And when I've done this with my counselling group where I study, and we all say, I am a bit like this sometimes, I'm a bit like that other times, you know. So, okay, any questions? Okay, all right, so I'll try and move faster because I realise that I could literally talk for ages. So, all right, this is where we're moving into the territory of emotional attunement. Okay, so we have maybe attachment styles to do with the way that we've related with our caregivers, and we have learned something about the world from we've created a belief system based on our experience of relationships. Okay, so that's where we're up to so far. So the important bit, in secure attachment, there are 2 key components. One is emotional communication, and 2 is attunement. Okay, let's break it down. So emotional communication is where we are empowered to show our full range of emotions We accept that all emotions are valid. We were talking before about so-called positive versus so-called negative. We might want to call them comfortable versus uncomfortable emotions. And how do we learn that all emotions are valid, and how do we learn to express our full range? Well, theory is that it's to do with caregivers responding appropriately to our spectrum of emotional states as children. Now, the second component was attunement. Okay, so now this breaks down into two parts. One is sensitivity. It's where a caregiver can gauge the infant's need and emotional state. And they don't overstimulate, they don't understimulate, and they make sure they respond in synchrony, and they don't reject the infant. It's very much gauging accurately the emotional state. Now, an additional part of this is called mind-mindedness. And it's basically the same thing as sensitivity, except you also show an understanding of the infant's mental state by verbalizing it. So, for example, if a child cries and the mum returns and comforts the child, this is sensitivity. If a child cries and the mum returns, comforts, and recognizes the source of the distress being her absence, and talks to the child about that, this is mind-mindedness. So, for example, she might say, "Oh, you were worried because I left the room and you wanted me to come back." Okay. So I think one of the most interesting things for me is that research shows it's the number of non-attuned comments that predicts insecure attachment. So, you know, you've got the communication part, teaching kids that it's okay to express all their emotions and what the emotions are. And you've also got this attunement part where it's about being emotionally understood and responded to appropriately. And it's about caregivers getting it wrong. That can be quite, you know, that seems to be the crux of the issue. But again, I don't want to say, oh, it's not, it's set in stone and it can't be resolved. I'm just saying that this is the groundwork that then later in adulthood may need to be reworked somewhat. Okay, moving on. I'll skip some stuff because I can see that I'm going over time. Okay. Okay, I'm skipping two sections, so I'm just going to go on to say that what has been discovered is that emotional experience is interpersonal. You know, we've really looked at this. It's physiological, it's interpersonal, and therefore it's highly shaped by other people. So our emotional development is influenced in infancy, particularly through the mechanism of emotional regulation. How well can we regulate our emotions? And the definition of emotional regulation is this. Emotional regulation consists of internal and external processes involved in initiating, maintaining, and modulating the occurrence, intensity, and expression of emotion. Okay? Emotional regulation is basically down to how you can moderate when you get emotional, how intense it is, and how you express that. Okay, so in childhood, the three mechanisms for caregivers influencing their children's ability to regulate their emotions is three parts. First part is modeling. Kids learn through observation. So how adults or older kids model emotion and dealing with emotion is one way in which children are learning how to regulate their emotions. A second part is parenting practices, and that is the behavior and the discourse around emotions. What do parents say about emotions? It's also called the meta-emotional philosophy. Do you believe emotions are good or bad? What are your beliefs about it? That's influential as well. and also what strategies are taught to children to manage their emotions. And then the third component is the emotional climate of the family. And so that's something we've talked about a moment ago, and it's about, you know, how attuned family members are, what's the vibe of the family, because emotions are contagious. Does it promote emotional security or insecurity? And it's not only about parents, and it's not only about family, peers, culture, all of this influences, and it's also bi-directional. I think that's really important to say. It's not a one-way street. The way the child responds to another person, or the way that they elicit a response, influences. It's backwards, forwards, backwards, forwards. Okay, so moving to adulthood then, and this is the bit where you know it's like, well, what do I do with this information? In adulthood then, if we're thinking about these beliefs about the world, beliefs about self, relationships, and others, then by identifying our beliefs and working to shift those beliefs, that is a powerful way of developing our emotional literacy. That's one strategy. Another is this point of emotional communication. We need the full range of our emotions, and they're all valid. So that knowledge works to help us become more accepting of ourselves and to work towards expressing our full range of emotion as perfectly acceptable. Third component is attunement. Attunement to self. Can you identify the sensations? Do you know what your needs are? Do you realize what emotion you're currently experiencing? Can you be non-rejecting of yourself? The answer may be, like right now, no, but these three areas so far are areas we work towards to develop emotional literacy, emotional attunement. Also context. Remember that culture, family, our own interpretation all influence how we experience emotion and what we think of it. So again, we can shift our beliefs. Also, others. Emotions are interpersonal, they're shaped by others. Surrounding ourselves with people whose emotional responses are, they can be the models for us. Where we pick up our emotional cues from. Who do we admire? Who do we notice soothes us? Recognizing how relating to other people affects us emotionally can be a very powerful strategy. And then finally, we're nearly done. I said before about attunement, well then that's very much about the body, about physiology and our behavior. Actually being able to feel, being able to self-soothe, being able to anticipate things that would be emotionally challenging for us and responding to those and adjusting the responses to those over time and gradually with lots of work. So this is why I pre-record the videos, because I can do them a lot faster and without so many meandering bits. So anyway, that's me done. I'll stop recording and you can come back online.